Straight ahead on Law&Crime Daily. Attorney Jeff Storms joins us to discuss the Daunte Wright case, as a former officer stands charged with shooting and killing the 20-year-old.
This officer pulled, aimed, and shot her firearm in practice. So don't tell us it's an accident.
Plus, our legal analysis on possible appeals for Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd.
I do think it will hit the Supreme Court.
Plus, heartbreak, a car, and a gun. Everything you need to know about the upcoming trial of Joshua Aide. And how Lady Gaga's Frenchies helped capture 5 members of an alleged underground dog-napping ring. Law&Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law&Crime Daily. I'm Brian Buckmire. Co-host Terri Austin is off. The training records for a former police officer charged in the death of a 20-year-old Minnesota man are now coming under fire. Daunte Wright was shot and killed by police during a traffic stop earlier this month. Now, former officer Kim Potter is charged with second-degree manslaughter. She allegedly mistakenly used her gun instead of a taser to subdue Wright as they tried to arrest him. The 26-year-old veteran of the force was acting as a training officer, but her newly released service file shows few details about her own training history. She has a bachelor's in criminal justice and underwent special law enforcement training in 1995. Brooklyn Center officials have not said whether any materials, including commendations or principle, have not yet been made public. I'm joined now by civil rights attorney Jeff Storms, who represents Daunte Wright's family. Jeff, let's get right to the heart of this. What do you say to those that say former Officer Potter was doing her job and just really made a really bad accident or mistake?
Yeah, to say that is nonsense. The difference between a firearm and a taser are legion. There are many differences. They look differently. You carry one on your dominant side, meaning your sidearm is on your dominant side to protect against an accidental draw. You wear your taser on your weak side. They look differently. They feel differently. You're trained over and over again not to make this mistake. And so when we look at the facts of this case, we're going to see that this officer, Officer Potter, had to engage in numerous intentional acts to get to the point from where she removed her sidearm from its holster and pulled the trigger, killing Daunte Wright.
And Jeff, what do you make of Potter's training background or lack thereof?
We're early on in the case at this point, and whether or not Officer Potter was properly trained is obviously going to be a critical issue in the civil litigation with respect to Brooklyn Center's own civil liability. So I don't want to comment prematurely, but what I can say is, certainly we should all be asking questions as to whether or not that training was enough. We have, Daunte Wright dead. We have an officer who was training other officers and, pulled her sidearm at a time where it was unreasonable and unlawful to do so. So certainly there are going to be repeated questions about training. And, one of the questions we're going to have is, was she also engaging in training outside of the department that's been known to be dangerous and associated with other deaths? And in particular, I'm talking about the killology training we've seen around the country, or warrior training, as it's described as well.
Absolutely.
So there are going to be very important questions we're going to have to answer in this case.
I can see that for sure. Thanks, Jeff. And of course, Wright's death happened just miles from the court during the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Chauvin will appeal his conviction in the death of George Floyd, and some lawyers think it could go all the way to the Supreme Court. Angenette Levy is here to explain why that could happen.
And this was watched, of course, around the world, and that's not a bad, but it's what happened before and during the trial outside of the courtroom that some lawyers believe could cause issues on appeal. Some of them believe that this case could end up at the highest court in the land.
Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict.
The jury in Derek Chauvin's trial found him guilty on all counts without asking a single question. Jurors heard from dozens of witnesses and saw videos of George Floyd dying. But there are questions about whether forces outside of the courtroom impacted the jurors. There were images of civil unrest, the police shooting of Daunte Wright, and comments from Congresswoman Maxine Waters about what should happen if there was not a guilty verdict.
This jury should have been sequestered from day one before they did openings. And I think that was a mistake on the part of Judge Cahill, who did a great job.
Former federal prosecutor and Law&Crime legal analyst Gene Rossi agrees with an opinion voiced by constitutional law expert Alan Dershowitz that Chauvin's case will likely end up at the U.S. Supreme Court.
I think the Supreme Court is salivating to give some guidance to judges at the lower levels on how to conduct high-profile cases.
Rossi likens the Chauvin case to Sam Shepard's. Shepard was a doctor in Cleveland whose wife, Marilyn, was murdered in 1954. Shepard said an intruder killed his wife, but he was charged and convicted of her murder. The U.S. Supreme Court vacated Shepard's conviction in 1966, citing a carnival atmosphere surrounding the trial and inflammatory pretrial publicity. Shepard was acquitted at a new trial that year. Attorney F. Lee Bailey argued Sam Shepard's case at the Supreme Court.
I see vague similarities, but certainly the cases are much more disparate than they are similar.
Bailey doubts Chauvin received a fair trial since the jury was selected in Hennepin County, but he says pretrial publicity was not the issue.
The problem with Chauvin is the public was being told, if we can get this guy convicted, it will help us with our law enforcement conflicts around the country, which is nonsense. But I can't imagine that the jurors didn't have that in mind when they were being impaneled. You better vote guilty or your next door neighbor might be throwing paint on your house.
Bailey does not believe Chauvin's case will go to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, juror Brandon Mitchell spoke with Law&Crime about the deliberations, which he says lasted about 6 hours.
We were ready for a guilty verdict once we walked to the deliberation room. I thought it would be a quicker process, but there wasn't any conversation on, what's going to happen if we acquit or anything like that.
Now, Derek Chauvin and the 3 other officers charged in George Floyd's death will likely all face federal civil rights charges. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune is reporting and has been reporting that there were plans in place had Chauvin been acquitted. There were going to be FBI agents, federal agents that went in, placed him under arrest and took him into custody, and the charges would have been announced immediately. That is actually very similar to what we were hearing here at Law&Crime. We were hearing in the weeks before the trial that had Chauvin been convicted, or he would be convicted, that there would be charges announced immediately to ensure the public that justice was being done. Brian?
Thanks, Angenette. Jeff Storms is back with us. He also represents George Floyd's family. Jeff, personally, I don't think the Shepard case is really close to the Chauvin trial. In Shepard, for example, the court allowed a temporary table of 90 reporters to sit next to the jurors and the defendant. Do you think Chauvin has an argument here?
I really don't. The point that you just made is certainly one of the critical distinctions. The attorneys in that case physically did not have room to access their own exhibits or have confidential communications with their clients. Really, other critical distinctions were the lack of anonymity for the jurors. The jurors in that case became celebrities. Everyone who knew who they were getting hate mail. They were forced with the concept that, their verdict was going to be known and criticized, and individuals in their community were going to be able to access them. And, another critical distinction was that the jurors did not receive a very strong admonition in that case not to look at the media. And here, that's the complete opposite. The judge was very stern with the jurors that they were not to look in the media.
Absolutely. No, Angenette, so far one juror who deliberated said that there was no outside influence, but as we hear from more jurors, could there be a potential legal issue here for Chauvin?
I think it just depends. If somebody comes out, 1, 2, 3 jurors, and they come out and say, I was really fearful of what was going to happen and I feel differently, you just never know. It could create an issue on appeal. And also, this is a much different time than 1954. Much different time. We have a lot more media coming in on our phones. This was
Absolutely.
A pressure cooker environment, so we really don't know what the jury was thinking and feeling as they were deliberating, but we may find out in the weeks ahead.
Absolutely. We have to wait and see as they come forward. Thank you both. Still ahead on Law&Crime Daily, the first photo to the fraternity at the time of the incident. 6 of the 8 were charged with involuntary manslaughter. All 8 indicted are between the ages of 19 and 23 years old. Now to Texas, where the death of a man who died in police custody is now being ruled a homicide. Marvin Scott III was in Collin County Jail for marijuana possession when he began to behave, quote, strange, according to Collin County Sheriff Jim Skinner. The sheriff says several officers tried to restrain Scott, but the struggle escalated. The officers reportedly pepper sprayed Scott and placed a spit mask over his head. Skinner went on to say that the 26-year-old became unresponsive. Scott apparently received medical attention immediately, but was later pronounced dead. The medical examiner now says Scott's death was caused by a fatal acute stress response in an individual with previously diagnosed schizophrenia during restraint struggle with law enforcement. Scott's family was able to watch several videos of the detainment on Wednesday and believes he was suffering from a mental health crisis.
Marvin Scott often used marijuana to treat his diagnosed schizophrenic condition because the meds offered didn't react well in his system, and he found that marijuana smoothed him out for a bit. If this was a concern at all, it was a mental health concern.
7 officers were fired and an 8th one resigned after Scott's death. All right, let's bring civil rights attorney Jeff Storms back in to discuss. Jeff, you've obviously been in this position before. You and the family have seen a video and see something wrong in the loss of that family member. What is the family of Marvin Scott III and Lee Merritt going through right now? And could this case affect others like it?
Well, it's a tremendous amount of pain initially. It's really hard to come to grips with seeing the loss of your loved one. But then when you have the announcement that came out from the ME's office, it's very different than the independent autopsy that the family commissioned, which said it was an asphyxiation death. And it's subtle, but it's still different. And so right now, a bunch of the evidence is being withheld and maintained as private by law enforcement. And you want to begin to be able to get your narrative out there so people understand that your loved one was killed by law enforcement, and this just wasn't an unfortunate event.
And do you see this case being so similar to others, maybe having an effect on other cases as well, with asphyxiation by police officers?
Yeah, and the video is going to be really critical for that, Brian, because asphyxiation forever caused deaths in individuals who were restrained by law enforcement, but without the video, we weren't able to prove it. And so the Floyd case showed the world that with really clear video, proving that a individual was murdered by law enforcement through asphyxiation is much easier with that video evidence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff Storms. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, an inside look into the suspects charged with the death and disappearance of a Georgia beauty queen. Plus, all's fair in love and car ownership. Our preview of the Law and Crime Network's next Gavel to Gavel trial coverage you don't want to miss. And now to check in on what's going on at the Law and Crime Network, Jesse Weber is here to tell us about this week's episode on his true crime show, Prime Crime.
Hey there, Brian. Yeah, we're talking about the unsettling case of Tara Grinstead, former beauty queen and teacher who disappeared in 2005. Fast forward over 10 years later.
He told me that he had gone to her house that night, used a credit card to get him through the front door lock, and strangled her in bed.
The issue, though, is do we really have the full story as to what happened to Grinstead? And is everyone telling the truth? Tune in to Law and Crime.
Thanks, Jesse. Jury selection in the trial of a Wisconsin man charged in a brazen shooting that left 1 dead and 2 others injured is scheduled for Monday. Was it love gone wrong? Police say Joshua Aide was dating his girlfriend 5 years before she called it quits in March 2020. According to court records, text messages show his ex wanted him to remove a broken down car from her property. Oshkosh police said Aide went to the woman's home and started shooting. Her father, James Grutnier, was shot and killed. The woman and a family friend were also shot. Both of them survived. Aide is charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He's pleading not guilty and says he was acting in self-defense. He faces up to life in prison. Tune into Law and Crime Network for Gavel to Gavel coverage beginning Monday. Here with us again is civil rights attorney Jeff Storms and Law and Crime reporter Angenette Levy. Angenette, a murder victim, 2 surviving victims, and these reported text messages. Does this look like a strong case for the prosecution?
You know, it very well could be, depending on what those text messages reveal. We don't know exactly what all of them say, but keep in mind, he's claiming self-defense. So this is what's called an affirmative defense, meaning he is going to have to actually prove that he acted in self-defense. However, the burden that he has is not as strong or as high as the prosecution's burden. So he's planning to testify. So it depends on really how well he does it on the stand, and if he is able to explain his actions to the jury and they believe, but with a preponderance or by a preponderance of the evidence, which they kind of describe as being like 51% or greater than 50%, if they believe that he acted in self-defense and had no other choice.
Now, Jeff, real quickly, self-defense, does that argument make sense to you, or are we missing some facts here?
Well, we certainly need to hear more facts, but it's really hard to understand how it is that this individual affirmatively went over to that home, was upset about something, and this shooting occurs, and that's self-defense. It's going to be a little difficult to believe that.
Yeah, we'll make sure to check this case out as Law and Crime is covering it from gavel to gavel. When we come back, a dog bust in LA, how the dog napping of Lady Gaga's pooches led to 5 people being arrested. The twists and charges after the break. Welcome back. The first photo of Jeffrey Epstein's accused madam behind bars is now released with a black eye on full display. Ghislaine Maxwell is seen here with a wrinkly face and a bruise under her eye. The former socialite isn't saying how her eye became bruised. Maxwell's attorneys released the photo and are claiming she got the shiner from covering her eyes at night because the guards do wellness checks on her every 15 minutes. Maxwell is facing 6 federal charges, including sex trafficking and perjury. Harvey Weinstein could be extradited to Los Angeles in 30 days. The disgraced Hollywood mogul will be facing 11 charges of rape and sexual assault upon his arrival in the Golden State. His attorneys told a New York judge on Friday they plan to fight his transfer, saying the former producer might ask the state's governor to deny the request. A jury convicted Weinstein of rape and sexual assault in New York last year. He's currently serving a 23-year sentence. 19 Kids and Counting star Josh Dugar has been arrested by federal law enforcement in Arkansas and is charged with receipt and possession of child pornography. Dugar is pleading not guilty, but this is not the first time the father of 6, plus one on the way, has found himself in trouble with the law. In 2015, he was accused and investigated in relation to child molestation. Dugar's car dealership was raided in a federal probe in 2019 for unknown reasons. Dugar is also facing a civil lawsuit in connection with real estate fraud. 5 people have been caught and arrested in connection with Lady Gaga's dog napping. Angenette Levy is back to talk about the pop star's pooches.
Yeah, Brian, this is a crazy story. 3 men have actually been charged with attempted murder and armed robbery, while 2 others have been charged with being accessories to the crime. You may recall that a man named Ryan Fisher was actually walking Lady Gaga's dogs. They were French bulldogs. Their names Gustav and Koji. And Ryan Fisher was actually shot in this whole ordeal. Fisher survived, and the Frenchies were returned to the Born This Way singer, Jennifer McBride. She is the self-proclaimed Good Samaritan who returned the dogs. She is now facing charges. The LAPD investigated McBride and found a dog theft ring while investigating. James Jackson, Jalen White, and Lafayette Whaley now face attempted murder and robbery charges for the theft. McBride and Harold White were also charged as accessories. The LAPD says the thieves wanted the dogs because of their value, not because they belonged to Lady Gaga. French bulldogs can go for thousands of dollars on the black market, and police say that 4 of the suspects are actually gang members. They are all expected back in court next month. Brian?
Thanks, Angenette. Jeff, I know you're a big dog owner just like myself, and Angenette's got one as well. But this dog napping, I know in Brooklyn, you're never going to win a jury like this. In Los Angeles, I'm assuming it's going to be the same thing. What do you think about the potential for this being a trial case?
I think there's going to have to be a plea here. Everyone loves dogs, and what happened to this poor dog walker was so tragic. And so to go to trial on this case, I think would be probably a losing proposition.
Yeah, they'd definitely be barking up the wrong tree there. Angenette, Lady Gaga was offering a $500,000 reward for her pups, but that won't be paid out, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Typically in these cases, Brian, you get a big reward like that or any type of reward when the information leads to the conviction of someone involved in the crime. In this case, McBride is accused of being part of this plot. And someone was shot at. Ryan Fisher was shot and wounded. He could have been killed, and he has suffered some very serious injuries because of this whole thing. So there is no way that this reward will be paid out to her in this case. Maybe there's somebody else we don't know about that provided some information, but it's definitely not McBride.
Yeah, it's also going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Maybe this expands to other charges, because like you said, there was a dog napping ring. Jeff, Angenette, thank you for joining us here today. And thank you for joining us here on the Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.